My parents kicked me out onto the street at 11 o'clock at night simply because I got a job and could no longer be a free babysitter for my sister. They threw my bags onto the lawn and then had the nerve to lie to our entire extended family about why I left. They spun a massive web of deception, painting me as a rebellious, ungrateful daughter who abandoned her flesh and blood. So I went nuclear and exposed every single one of their lies with hard financial proof. Now they are desperately trying to force me back into their lives because their new professional babysitter quit on the spot and their perfect image is crumbling to pieces. My name is Kiara. I am 22 years old, and this is how I took down my toxic family and built my own empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to break a generational curse and stand up to people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. It was a typical Sunday evening in late May, the kind of sweltering Atlanta night where the humidity hangs thick in the air. We were all gathered around the heavy oak dining table in my parents' spacious suburban home. The smell of fried chicken, collard greens, and macaroni and cheese filled the room, a deceptive comfort that masked the reality of our family dynamic. I was sitting at the corner of the table exactly where I always sat, quietly observing the performance happening around me. My older sister Nia, who was 26 and the undisputed golden child of the household, was holding court. She was feeding her youngest toddler while complaining loudly about how exhausting her Pilates classes were. Her husband Trevor, a 28-year-old tech manager who always wore golf shirts and an air of unearned superiority, nodded along sympathetically. Trevor was white wealthy and exactly the kind of son-in-law my status-obsessed parents had always dreamed of parading around their country club friends. I had spent the last 4 years quietly suffocating under the weight of their expectations. While I studied late into the night for my finance degree, I was constantly interrupted to change diapers, run errands, or cook meals for Nia and Trevor. They treated me less like a sister and daughter, and more like an unpaid domestic worker, who should be grateful just to breathe the same air as them. But I had kept my head down, maintained a perfect grade point average, and endured grueling interview processes for months. I had finally secured my escape route, and tonight was the night I was going to share my triumph. I waited for a lull in the conversation. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had practiced this moment in my bedroom mirror dozens of times, imagining my mother's tears of joy and my father's proud embrace. I took a deep breath, smoothing my napkin over my lap to hide my trembling hands. "I have some really exciting news to share with everyone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I got the job. I received my official offer letter on Friday. I will be starting as a junior financial analyst at Vanguard Capital downtown next Monday. The starting salary is $75,000 a year with full benefits." I smiled, looking around the table, waiting for the eruption of cheers. I waited for my parents to tell me how proud they were that their youngest daughter had landed a highly competitive role at one of the most prestigious investment funds in the city, straight out of college. I waited for Nia to congratulate me on finally starting my career. Instead, the dining room went completely terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the hum of the ceiling fan overhead and the faint clinking of ice settling in Trevor's water glass. My mother stopped chewing her food. My father lowered his fork slowly, his brow furrowing as if I had just spoken to him in a foreign language. Nobody smiled. Nobody clapped. Nobody even offered a polite word of congratulations. The heavy, oppressive silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, draining every ounce of joy and excitement right out of my chest. The suffocating quiet was finally broken by a sharp, violent sound. Nia slammed her heavy silver fork down onto her ceramic plate so hard I thought the dish might shatter. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table and her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered outrage. "So who exactly is picking up my kids at 3 o'clock in the afternoon?" she demanded, her voice shrill and accusatory. I blinked, genuinely caught off guard by the sheer absurdity of her response. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nia scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were the most selfish person on earth. I said, "Who is picking up my children? Trevor works late at his tech firm, and my schedule is completely packed. You cannot just spring this on us out of nowhere. You are supposed to be watching the kids all summer. We already agreed on this arrangement months ago. Trevor leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, looking at me with that condescending smirk I had grown to despise. He shook his head slowly, adopting the tone of a disappointed parent, disciplining a wayward teenager. Kiara, you have to understand how irresponsible this is, he said smoothly. We had a verbal commitment from you. Nia and I planned our entire summer schedule around you being available to help out around the house and watch the little ones. You cannot just abandon your family responsibilities because you found some entry-level office job. It is incredibly selfish to leave us in a bind like this right before the summer starts. You need to call that company tomorrow morning and decline the offer. Your family needs you here more than some corporate boss does. I sat there frozen in my chair, listening to this wealthy grown man tell me that my $75,000 salary was just a little entry-level distraction. He was sitting at my parents' dining table, eating the food my mother prepared, demanding that I sacrifice my entire future so his wife could have free childcare while she went to fitness classes. The sheer audacity of his demand left me breathless. I looked toward my parents, expecting them to step in and defend my achievement, but they were both nodding along with Trevor. That was the exact moment I realized my family did not see me as a person with goals and dreams. They only saw me as a resource to be used and discarded at their convenience. I turned to my mother. My father sat next to her, his jaw tight, his silence speaking volumes. He had always deferred to my mother when it came to household rules, and tonight was no different. I looked into the eyes of the woman who raised me, waiting for her to shut this down, waiting for her to tell Trevor to back off and congratulate her youngest daughter. Instead, my mother Darlene slowly wiped her mouth with her linen napkin and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She looked at me not with pride, but with deep disappointment. Kiara, your brother-in-law is absolutely right, she said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of maternal condescension that cuts straight to the bone. You are being completely unreasonable right now. Do you honestly think some entry-level paper-pushing job is more important than showing up for your blood? I felt the air leave my lungs. Entry-level paper-pushing job. I had spent 4 years grinding through advanced calculus and corporate finance courses. I had beaten out hundreds of applicants for this position. But to my mother it was nothing. It was just a silly little hobby getting in the way of my real purpose, serving my older sister. Mom, it is Vanguard Capital, I pleaded, trying to make her understand the magnitude of this. This is a career-defining opportunity. I am making $75,000 a year right out of the gate. I can finally start building my own life. My mother slammed her hand flat against the oak table, causing the silverware to rattle. Her eyes narrowed and the temperature in the room plummeted. Do not sit at my table and talk to me about building your own life, she snapped, her voice rising in volume and intensity. You think you are better than us now because some corporate white men gave you a desk and a salary. You think that piece of paper from your university makes you exempt from your duties to this family. Let me tell you something about how the real world works, little girl. Black families do not survive by operating like isolated islands. We do not survive by putting our selfish individual desires ahead of the collective. We survive because we stick together. We survive because we sacrifice for each other. She spoke with the rhythm and cadence of a Sunday morning sermon, turning her personal convenience into a matter of cultural survival. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was taking the very real history and struggles of our community and weaponizing them to force me into submission. She leaned forward, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. You are sitting here acting like these people on television, putting your own greedy ambition before the survival and well-being of your own flesh and blood. Your sister is trying to build a foundation for her children. Your nieces and nephews need you, and you want to toss them aside so you can go play pretend executive downtown. You are turning your back on your roots, Kiara. You are letting that westernized, individualistic mindset poison your values. We raised you to know that family comes first no matter what. You owe this family. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We clothed you. And the second you get a taste of independence, you try to run off and leave your sister struggling. I sat there absorbing the heavy, toxic weight of her words. This was the trap. This was the invisible generational curse designed to keep me chained to the floor so Nia could continue to climb. They wrapped their exploitation in the noble language of family loyalty and cultural solidarity. They called it sacrifice, but it was really just extortion. They demanded my time, my youth, and my future to subsidize a lifestyle Nia and Trevor could not actually afford to maintain on their own. If Trevor was so successful, why could they not pay for a professional nanny? Why was the burden of their childcare falling entirely on the shoulders of a 22-year-old recent graduate who was just trying to get her footing in the world? I looked at Nia, who was watching our mother tear me apart with a look of smug satisfaction. Then I looked at Trevor, who was confidently drinking his water, fully expecting me to cave under the maternal pressure. A profound sense of clarity washed over me. I was not going to cry. I was not going to beg for their understanding. I was simply going to state the facts. I squared my shoulders and looked directly into my mother's angry eyes. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the hysteria they were trying to provoke. "Mom, I love this family," I began slowly and deliberately. "But I will not set myself on fire to keep Nia warm. I am not abandoning anyone. I am simply moving forward with my own life. I am an adult. I have worked incredibly hard for this degree, and I am not going to throw away a massive career opportunity so Nia can attend her mid-morning Pilates classes and go to brunch with her friends." Nia gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as if I had just spoken pure blasphemy. "How dare you?" she shrieked. "You have no idea how hard it is to be a mother. I need help." Trevor slammed his hand on the table, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are crossing a line, Kiara," he warned, his voice dropping an octave. "You do not disrespect your sister in this house. You do need help," I agreed, nodding calmly at Nia, completely ignoring Trevor's outburst. "But I am not a childcare professional. I am a financial analyst. If you and Trevor need full-time childcare for the summer, you need to hire a professional nanny and pay them a fair wage. You cannot rely on free labor from your younger sister just to maintain your lifestyle. Trevor makes 6 figures. You live in a beautiful house in the suburbs. You can afford to pay for the services you need. Expecting me to sacrifice my entire career trajectory and my financial independence so you can save a few $1,000s on daycare is not family loyalty. It is financial abuse." The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody had ever spoken to Nia that way. Nobody had ever dared to challenge the narrative that Nia was the hard-working, overwhelmed mother who deserved endless support, and that I was the selfish, ungrateful daughter who needed to be disciplined. I had just ripped the mask off their entire arrangement. I had called it exactly what it was. I could see the rage boiling in my father's eyes now, too. The audacity I had to sit at their table and refuse to comply with the family script was unforgivable to them. I had broken the ultimate rule. I had chosen my own future over my sister's convenience. And in that dining room, surrounded by the people who were supposed to celebrate my victories, the battle lines were permanently drawn. Trevor pushed his chair back from the table. The wood scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, vibrating through the room like a warning shot. He stood up, towering over the dining arrangement, with his face flushed a deep mottled red. "After everything we have done for you," he sputtered, his voice trembling with a mix of manufactured outrage and fragile ego. "After my wife and your parents have bent over backward to accommodate you in this house, you have the nerve to sit there and call us abusers. You sleep under this roof, Kiara. You eat the food that your parents buy with their hard-earned money. You use the utilities that we all chip in to cover. And you think you can just march in here, demand respect, and throw your new salary in our faces." He pointed a finger at me, acting like the ultimate patriarch of a family that was not even his to begin with. "You are incredibly ungrateful. Nia has been nothing but loving to you. She included you in our children's lives. She gave you the privilege of bonding with your nieces and nephews while you were studying. Most young women would kill for that kind of tight-knit family connection. But you want to trade all of that away for a cubicle and a paycheck. It is pathetic. You are blinded by your own arrogance, and you do not even realize how much damage you are doing." My mother was not about to let Trevor be the only one delivering the punishment. She stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled over backward, hitting the wall behind her with a loud thud. The veins in her neck were visibly throbbing. Her hands were curled into tight fists at her sides. "Do not you dare speak to your brother-in-law." That way she screamed, the volume of her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the suburban house. "Do not you dare sit at my dining table eating the meal I spent hours cooking and lecture my family about financial abuse. You arrogant little brat, you think you know everything because you read a few books and passed some college exams. You know nothing about loyalty. You know nothing about actual survival in this world." I tried to speak to defend my position, but she completely talked over me, shutting down any attempt I made to reason with her. "I am not listening to another word of your disrespectful garbage," she continued, her voice reaching a fever pitch that made my ears ring. "We sacrificed everything for you to go to that school. We stayed up late praying over your future. We protected you from the harsh realities of the world out there, and this is exactly how you repay us. By turning your back on your own sister when she needs you the most. By acting like our traditional way of life is somehow beneath your new corporate standards. You are a traitor. You are a traitor to your blood and a traitor to this family." Nia sat back in her chair, holding her toddler close to her chest, playing the perfect wounded victim. She let out a soft theatrical sob, burying her face in her husband's arm, as if my boundary setting was a physical attack against her. Trevor wrapped his arm tightly around her shoulders, shooting me a look of absolute disgust. "See what you did," he whispered sharply, leaning across the table. "See how much pain you are causing your sister just because you want to be selfish. You are tearing this family apart, Kiara." My mother walked to the head of the table, planting her hands firmly on the polished oak wood. She leaned toward me, her eyes cold and completely devoid of any maternal affection. I had never seen her look at me with such pure, unadulterated hatred. "I am giving you a single choice, Kiara," she said, her voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that was somehow more terrifying than her screaming. "You are going to call that company tomorrow morning and decline that job offer. You are going to apologize to your sister and your brother-in-law for your disgusting behavior tonight. You are going to fulfill your duties to this family for the rest of the summer, just exactly like we agreed." She paused, letting the heavy, toxic weight of her demands settle over the stifling room. The air felt thick and impossible to breathe. "And if you refuse," she continued, her words slicing through the tense air like a blade, "then you can pack your bags tonight. Quit by Sunday, or find somewhere else to sleep. This house does not harbor traitors." The room fell into a suffocating stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape its cage. Kicked out. She was literally threatening to throw me out onto the street over a babysitting dispute. She was willing to render her own daughter homeless, simply because I refused to be a free domestic servant. I desperately turned my head to look at my father. He had been sitting silently through this entire horrific ordeal, staring blankly at his half-eaten plate of cold food. He was the man who had taught me how to ride a bike, the man who had helped me with my middle school math homework, the man who always told me to work hard and aim high. Surely he would not allow this to happen. Surely he would see the absolute insanity of throwing his youngest daughter out into the night just as she was launching her professional career. "Dad," I pleaded, my voice finally cracking under the immense suffocating pressure of the moment. "Dad, tell her she is being unreasonable. Tell her I cannot throw away this job. Please, you know how hard I worked for this opportunity. You know what this means for my future." My father slowly raised his heavy head. I searched his eyes for a lifeline, for a shred of empathy or a sign of protection. I waited for him to stand up and intervene, to be the parent I so desperately needed in that moment. Instead, he simply let out a long, defeated sigh. He crossed his arms tightly across his chest, closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second, and then turned his head completely away from me. He looked toward the empty living room, refusing to meet my gaze. He did not say a single word. He did not offer a single objection. His silence was louder and more destructive than any of my mother's screams. In that devastating gesture, my father cemented my complete and utter isolation. He had chosen his peace over my future. He had chosen to enable my mother's tyranny and my sister's entitlement rather than defend his own flesh and blood. The realization washed over me like a bucket of freezing ice water, shocking my system and clearing my vision. There was no safety net here. There was no unconditional love waiting for me to fall back on. There was only rigid compliance or absolute exile. My family had drawn their line in the sand, and I was standing entirely alone on the other side. The reality of my father's cowardice settled over me, chilling my blood. There was no more debate. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a slow, deliberate scrape that mirrored Trevor's earlier movement. I did not say a single word. I simply turned my back on the dining room and walked straight down the hallway toward my bedroom. I could hear my mother screaming behind me, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor as she followed me. She was barking orders, demanding that I answer her, demanding that I show respect. I pulled my two large suitcases from the back of my closet and unzipped them on my bed. My mother stood in the doorway watching me empty my drawers. She crossed her arms, her chest heaving. "You think you are calling my bluff?" She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You think I will not put you out on the street tonight?" I kept my mouth shut. I grabbed my professional clothes, the blazers and slacks I had carefully thrifted for my new job, and folded them neatly into the luggage. My silence infuriated her more than any argument ever could. She stormed into the room, grabbing handfuls of my casual clothes from the dresser and throwing them haphazardly toward the bags. "If you want to act like a stranger, you can get out of my house right now," she yelled. "You have exactly 10 minutes before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." It was 11 o'clock at night on a Sunday. The thick, oppressive heat of the Atlanta summer was seeping through the window panes. I zipped up my suitcases, grabbed my laptop bag, and slung my purse over my shoulder. I dragged the heavy luggage down the hallway past the family photos that lined the walls. Photos of Nia at her graduation, Nia at her wedding, Nia holding her first baby. There were hardly any pictures of me. I realized then that I had always been a ghost in this house, haunting the background while my sister lived in the light. When I reached the front door, I opened it to the humid night air. My mother pushed past me, grabbing one of my smaller duffel bags and hurling it directly onto the front lawn. It landed with a dull thud against the manicured grass. I stepped out onto the porch. The harsh yellow glare of the security light illuminated the scene perfectly. Nia was standing on the porch, her youngest toddler balanced effortlessly on her hip. Trevor stood right behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. Nia was smirking. It was a cold, calculated expression of absolute victory. She looked down at my bags scattered on the grass and then back up at me. Her eyes were gleaming with the anticipation of my surrender. They all fully expected me to break. They were waiting for the tears to fall. They were waiting for the panic to set in, for the realization of homelessness to crush my spirit. They wanted me to drop to my knees, beg for forgiveness, promise to quit my job and swear eternal allegiance to their convenience. Trevor let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "You can still fix this, Kiara," he said, his tone sickly sweet. "Just apologize to your mother. Call the company tomorrow and tell them you made a mistake. We will forget this ever happened." Nia adjusted the baby on her hip and sighed. "Do not be stupid, Kiara," she added. "You do not have any money. You do not have anywhere to go. Just go back inside and do what you are told. It is not that hard." I looked at my sister. I looked at the smug, entitled man holding her. I looked at my mother, who was standing with her arms crossed, waiting to accept my groveling apology. For a brief second, I felt the terrifying weight of what was about to happen. I had less than $500 in my checking account. I had nowhere to sleep tonight. But looking at their expectant faces, I felt something far more powerful than fear. I felt a massive, overwhelming wave of absolute disgust. I was not going to give them the performance they craved. I walked down the porch steps, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete. I bent down and picked up my bags from the damp grass. I did not shed a single tear. My face remained a mask of total indifference. I dragged my luggage down the driveway toward my beat-up Honda Civic. It was an old, unreliable car with a dented bumper and faded paint, a stark contrast to the sleek luxury vehicles parked in my parents' garage. But that car was mine. I bought it with my own money from my campus jobs, and it was going to be my getaway vehicle. I popped the trunk and heaved my heavy suitcases inside, slamming the lid shut with a resounding bang that echoed through the quiet suburban street. The sound seemed to shatter the illusion my family was holding on to. The smirk vanished from Nia's face. The smugness drained out of Trevor's posture. My mother suddenly stepped forward to the edge of the porch, her arms uncrossing. Kiara, she called out, her voice, losing its commanding edge and slipping into something that sounded dangerously close to panic. Where do you think you are going? You get back here right now. She was realizing that her ultimate threat had failed. She had played her final card, and I had called her bluff. More importantly, she was realizing that tomorrow morning, she was going to have to wake up and take care of Nia's kids by herself, because her free labor was driving away. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the worn fabric seat. I rolled the window down just enough to hear the night sounds over the hum of the engine. I turned the key in the ignition. The old engine sputtered for a terrifying second before roaring steadily to life. I shifted into reverse. I looked out the window, making direct eye contact with my mother one last time. "Have a great summer finding a babysitter," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the humid air. I rolled the window up, cutting off whatever scream my mother was about to unleash. I backed out of the driveway, shifted into drive, and pressed my foot against the gas pedal. As I drove down the familiar tree-lined streets of my childhood neighborhood, a profound sense of isolation washed over me. I was officially homeless. I was estranged from everyone I shared blood with. I had no idea where I was going to sleep tonight. Yet, as the glowing skyline of downtown Atlanta appeared in the distance through my windshield, I gripped the steering wheel and let out a long, shaky breath. I was entirely alone, but for the first time in my 22 years of life, I was completely, entirely, and undeniably liberated. I parked outside Maya's apartment building that night, exhausted and running on pure adrenaline. Maya was a college friend who never asked too many intrusive questions. When I showed up at her door with my life packed into the trunk of a beat-up Honda Civic, she just took one look at my face, handed me a spare pillow, and pointed toward her faux leather sofa. That lumpy, squeaky sofa became my entire universe for the next 3 days. It was deeply uncomfortable and smelled faintly of cheap incense, but to me it felt like absolute royalty compared to the suffocating toxic house I had just managed to escape. I spent those first 2 nights staring up at Maya's ceiling fan, listening to the city traffic outside, and mentally preparing myself for the war I knew was coming. On Wednesday morning, the digital assault officially began. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage of Vanguard Capital, taking deep breaths and preparing to walk into my first day of work. I turned my phone off airplane mode. Immediately, the screen lit up like a frantic slot machine. Dozens upon dozens of text messages, missed calls, and angry social media tags flooded my notifications in a relentless wave. My family had not reached out to check if I was safe. They had not called to see if I had a roof over my head or food to eat. Instead, my mother had successfully unleashed the flying monkeys. The most aggressive attack came from Aunt Vivian, my mother's older sister and the undisputed gossip queen of our church congregation. I pressed play on her voicemail. Her voice vibrated through the small speaker of my phone, dripping with intense righteous indignation. "Kiara Danielle, I am absolutely disgusted with your behavior," she began, her tone loud and highly theatrical. "Your mother called me in absolute tears this morning. She said you completely lost your mind. How dare you max out your parents' credit cards to buy designer clothes and run off to downtown Atlanta to live some wild party lifestyle. You abandoned your sister when she needed you the most, just so you could go clubbing and chasing after foolishness. You are breaking your poor parents' hearts. Do not bother showing your face at Sunday service until you repent and beg for their forgiveness." I sat in the driver's seat staring blankly at the dashboard of my car, maxed out credit cards, designer clothes, a wild party lifestyle. I looked down at the thrifted black blazer and discount slacks I was wearing. I looked around the interior of my dented car, which currently contained everything I owned in the entire world. My mother had not just spun a little white lie to cover up the fact that she kicked me out over free babysitting. She had fabricated an entire cinematic narrative to completely assassinate my character. She knew that if she told the truth that she evicted her newly graduated daughter, simply because I refused to be Nia's unpaid servant, the extended family and the church community would judge her harshly. So she painted me as a rebellious, greedy, prodigal daughter who threw away her family's love for superficial thrills. She deliberately weaponized our community's deeply held values against me, knowing exactly which buttons to push to turn everyone I grew up with into a unified angry mob. I scrolled through the other messages. Cousins I had not spoken to in years were texting me long paragraphs, saying I was acting incredibly selfish and bringing shame to the family name. Family friends left passive-aggressive comments on my old social media posts, telling me to remember where I came from and to respect my elders. My phone had transformed into a glowing rectangle of pure, unadulterated hatred. They wanted a reaction. They desperately wanted me to call them crying, defending myself and begging them to believe the truth. They wanted me to engage in a messy, exhausting war of words that would ultimately drain my energy and prove their fabricated point that I was unstable. But I refused to give them the satisfaction. I turned my phone on, silent, flipped it over, and shoved it deep into the bottom of my work tote. I realized in that exact moment that absolute silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against toxic people. When you do not react, you completely starve them of the drama they need to survive. I was not going to waste a single breath trying to convince people of my innocence when they had already enthusiastically decided to believe my mother's comfortable lies. Let them think I was a selfish party girl. Let them think I was greedy. Their uneducated opinions did not pay my rent, and their harsh judgments would absolutely not build my secure future. I stepped out of my car and walked into the gleaming glass lobby of Vanguard Capital. The air conditioning was crisp, and the polished marble floors reflected the bright morning sunlight. I took all the rage, all the hurt, and all the bitter betrayal that was burning inside my chest and compacted it into a tight, hard sphere of pure motivation. I channeled every ounce of that dark, heavy energy into my first week on the job. While my family was busy gossiping about my fictional downfall, I was sitting in high-stakes financial meetings, absorbing complex data like a sponge. I arrived at the office an hour before anyone else and left long after the sun went down. My supervisors were immediately struck by my relentless focus and sharp attention to detail. They did not know that my laser-sharp concentration was fueled by the absolute terrifying necessity of survival. I was not just working to impress my bosses or earn a promotion. I was working to secure my permanent freedom. I analyzed market trends, built complex financial models, and delivered a preliminary quarterly report that caught the attention of the senior partners by Thursday afternoon. Every spreadsheet I perfected and every presentation I nailed was another solid brick in the fortress I was building against my family. The harder I worked, the less the noise from my phone mattered. By the time Friday evening rolled around, I had successfully completely insulated my mind from their toxic smear campaign. I went back to Maya's lumpy couch that night, bone-tired but deeply satisfied. I had survived the very first week of my brand new life, and the concrete foundation of my personal empire was already being poured. I fell asleep to the sounds of the city outside my window, knowing that while my mother and sister were desperately trying to destroy my reputation in the suburbs, I was quietly building a kingdom downtown where their petty lies could never ever reach me. The second week at Vanguard Capital began with a relentless electric rhythm. I practically inhaled financial models and quarterly projections. While my phone remained a dark, silent brick in my bag, I became an absolute machine on the trading floor. I was tasked with auditing a massive portfolio of underperforming tech startups. My managing director, a sharp, no-nonsense black woman named Evelyn, who demanded absolute perfection, handed me the file on Tuesday morning. She told me to find the leak. By Thursday afternoon, I had dug through thousands of rows of data and identified a $3 million discrepancy hidden deep within their valuation models. When I presented my findings in the executive boardroom, I did not stutter or shake. I stood tall in my new tailored suit and backed up every single claim with flawless, airtight data. Evelyn looked at my intricate spreadsheets, then looked up at me with a rare, approving smile. "Excellent work, Kiara," she said, her voice echoing across the long mahogany table. "That is exactly the kind of sharp forensic analysis we brought you here to do." In that corporate high-rise, I was not Nia's built-in babysitter or my mother's emotional scapegoat. I was a respected, valuable asset. That Friday morning, my phone buzzed with an alert from my banking app. I opened the notification while standing in the office break room, holding a warm cup of black coffee. I literally had to brace myself against the marble counter. My signing bonus and my first full paycheck had hit my account simultaneously. I stared at the bold green numbers flashing on the bright screen. It was more money deposited in a single day than I had ever possessed in my entire life. For years, I had begged my parents for $50 to buy college textbooks while they funneled all their resources into Nia's perfect lifestyle. Now I had thousands of dollars of clean, untethered money sitting securely under my own name. I took a deep, trembling breath, feeling a sudden, overwhelming rush of pure adrenaline coursing through my veins. The financial chains that my family had used to control me were officially broken forever. I did not waste a single second. On Saturday morning, I folded up Maya's spare blanket, thanked her profusely for saving my sanity, and drove straight to a luxury high-rise apartment complex in the heart of Buckhead. I walked into the sleek leasing office armed with my pristine credit score, my official corporate offer letter, and my freshly updated bank statements. The leasing agent handed me a glossy promotional brochure, but I already knew exactly what I wanted. Within 2 hours, I was signing a 12-month lease on a gorgeous corner unit on the 20th floor. When the agent handed me the heavy metallic keys, a wave of profound emotion washed over me. I rode the glass elevator up to my new floor and unlocked the heavy wooden door with a satisfying click. I stepped inside, and the sheer beauty of the space completely took my breath away. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The pristine hardwood floors gleamed flawlessly under the modern recessed lighting, and the open-concept kitchen featured immaculate white quartz countertops with stainless steel appliances. It smelled like fresh paint and unwritten futures. I walked slowly to the center of the empty sunlit living room and simply stood there soaking in the magnitude of the moment. Nobody could kick me out of this beautiful space. Nobody could use this roof over my head as a weapon to demand my free labor or silence my voice. I had successfully secured my own impenetrable fortress. My mother had thrown my bags onto the damp grass, expecting me to crawl back to her feet in absolute defeat. Instead, she had accidentally given me the exact push I desperately needed to build my own kingdom. My first purchase was not basic groceries or practical kitchen supplies. I drove straight to a high-end furniture boutique downtown and bought a massive plush emerald green velvet sofa. I paid for it in full without hesitation and arranged to have it delivered that exact same afternoon. When the delivery men left, I locked my heavy deadbolt and collapsed onto the soft, rich velvet cushions. The apartment was completely empty, except for that one magnificent green sofa and my two battered suitcases sitting in the hallway. But to me, it looked like an absolute masterpiece of survival. I lay there watching the city lights begin to flicker on one by one through the massive glass windows as the evening sky turned a deep, brilliant shade of indigo. The silence in my apartment was deep and absolute. It was a rich, healing quiet that I had never truly experienced in my entire life. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to clearly picture what was happening back at my parents' suburban house at that exact moment. It was Saturday evening. Without me there to cook dinner, bathe the screaming toddlers, and frantically organize the messy house, it would be pure, unadulterated chaos. I could vividly imagine the shrill sound of Nia's children throwing tantrums in the living room while she frantically complained to Trevor about her rising stress levels. I could picture Trevor pacing the hardwood floor, furiously angry that his perfect weekend relaxation was ruined by basic parental duties. I could see my mother snapping at my father, desperately trying to maintain control over a household that was rapidly spiraling out of order. Their comfortable world was entirely built on the foundation of my silent suffering, and without me holding the heavy pillars up, the roof was finally caving in on them. Here on the 20th floor, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and toasted to the vast empty room. I took a long, slow sip, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I did not have to listen to daily insults. I did not have to dodge Trevor's entitled demands or shrink my personality to make Nia feel superior. The stark, striking contrast between my serene, beautiful sanctuary and their toxic, chaotic reality was the sweetest, most satisfying form of justice. They wanted me to be homeless, broken, and destroyed. But as I watched the sunset paint the Atlanta skyline in brilliant shades of gold and purple, I knew I had never been more powerful, more grounded, or more alive. By the third week, the cracks in their perfectly curated suburban facade were too massive to hide. I was sitting on my emerald green sofa, sipping a perfectly frothed matcha latte, when my phone buzzed with a text from an old high school friend. She still attended my parents' church and had always been notoriously nosy. She sent me a long paragraph detailing how my mother had practically broken down in the middle of Sunday service, complaining that her blood pressure was skyrocketing because she had to suddenly manage 3 screaming toddlers every single day. My mother, the woman who claimed family sacrifice was our ultimate cultural duty, was apparently completely unable to handle the very sacrifice she had demanded of me. The irony was so rich, it tasted like expensive wine. But the real entertainment came directly from the source. I had muted my family on all social media platforms to protect my peace, but I still had an anonymous burner account that I used for market research. I pulled up Trevor's Instagram stories and watched his entire pristine image disintegrate in real time. Trevor had built his entire digital brand around being the ultimate tech bro family man. He loved posting pictures of his spotless house, his perfectly groomed children, and his relaxed, beautiful wife. Without me there to silently orchestrate that perfection, the reality was shockingly grim. In a video posted just that morning, Trevor was sitting in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He was ranting to the camera about how impossible it was to find good, reliable help these days. His tone was deeply bitter, laced with that specific brand of entitlement reserved for people who never actually had to lift a finger to maintain their own comfort. In the background of his next story, I caught a glimpse of their living room. It was an absolute disaster zone. Toys were strewn across the expensive rugs. Laundry was piled high on the dining table where they had just evicted me a few weeks prior. Nia walked through the frame for a split second looking completely haggard. Her hair was thrown into a messy bun, and she was wearing a stained sweatsuit. The smug, victorious smirk she had worn on the porch the night they threw me out was completely erased, replaced by deep, dark circles under her exhausted eyes. Their perfect marriage was buckling under the weight of basic domestic responsibilities. They had not built a successful life. They had built a stage play, and I had been the invisible stagehand, keeping the entire production from collapsing. I locked my phone and looked directly at my reflection in the massive glass window. The Atlanta skyline stretched out behind me, a sprawling testament to ambition and survival. This is what they never tell you about the black tax. It is not just about sending money back home when you make it big. The most insidious form of the black tax is the theft of your time, your youth, and your potential. It is the heavy, suffocating expectation that the youngest daughter, or the most capable woman in the family, must naturally sacrifice her own future to serve as the structural foundation for everyone else. They wrap this exploitation in beautiful, sacred words, like loyalty culture and respect for your elders. They teach you from the moment you can walk that choosing yourself is the ultimate betrayal. We are conditioned to believe that carrying the weight of our family dysfunction is a badge of honor. We are taught to be the strong black woman, to endure disrespect, to swallow our ambition, and to smile while our own dreams are actively suffocated. My mother genuinely believed she was doing the right thing by crushing my career because generational trauma had taught her that individual success was dangerous if it did not serve the immediate comfort of the collective. She wanted to pass that curse down to me, ensuring I would remain small, compliant, and entirely useful to my sister. Nia happily accepted the arrangement because entitlement is blinding. She truly believed her life and her marriage were inherently more valuable than my independence. But curses only work if you agree to participate in the ritual. By walking out of that door and refusing to look back, I had violently shattered a cycle that had likely been running through my family for generations. I was not being westernized or selfish. I was choosing to be the architect of my own destiny rather than the collateral damage in theirs. They needed a villain to blame for their crumbling household, so they cast me in the role. And sitting here in my beautiful, peaceful sanctuary, I happily accepted the title. If prioritizing my career, My mental health and my financial independence made me the bad guy in their story. Then I was going to be the most successful villain this city had ever seen. I refused to let my 20s become a casualty of their convenience. Every time I looked at Trevor's chaotic Instagram stories or heard another rumor about my mother's rising blood pressure, I felt zero guilt. They were finally being forced to pay the actual market price for the life they had chosen to build, and they were discovering that the bill was terrifyingly steep. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon when the final puzzle piece fell directly into my lap. I was sitting at my sleek kitchen island with a fresh cup of coffee, feeling the profound satisfaction of organizing my personal financial portfolio. As a financial analyst, I treated my own money with the exact same forensic intensity that I applied to my corporate clients. I wanted to consolidate all my old bank accounts, track my student loan payoffs, and build a flawless 10-year investment projection. To do that, I needed to pull my old tax returns and financial aid documents from my university days. I opened my laptop and logged into a legacy cloud storage account I had set up 5 years ago. It was a shared drive I originally created because my mother was completely technologically illiterate and needed a central place to drop scanned documents for my federal student aid applications. I had not looked at that specific drive since graduation day. As the folder directory loaded on my bright screen, I casually clicked through the archived years. Tucked away at the very bottom of the list was a subfolder simply labeled House Expenses. I frowned. That folder had not been there during my freshman year. I clicked it open. The cloud drive had automatically synced documents from a desktop computer linked to the account. Likely, my mother's old laptop sitting in the suburban living room I had just been exiled from. A long list of digital files populated my screen. They were monthly bank statements from a joint checking account registered under two names, Darlene and Nia. My analytical instincts instantly took over. Why would my mother and my married, supposedly financially independent sister share a joint checking account? I clicked on the most recent statement dated just 3 weeks prior to my explosive eviction. My eyes scanned the top line and my heart physically skipped a beat. The account balance was staggering, but it was the transaction history that made the blood freeze in my veins. On the second day of every single month, there was a massive incoming wire transfer, $4,000. The origin of the transfer was a private wealth management trust account belonging to Trevor's parents, the incredibly affluent white in-laws, who lived in a gated community in Connecticut. The memo line attached to the wire transfer was clear, clinical, and absolutely damning. It read Premium Nanny Service and Early Childhood Development. I sat frozen, my eyes darting back and forth across the glowing screen. $4,000 a month. $48,000 a year. Trevor's wealthy parents had been fully funding a high-end professional childcare service for their grandchildren. They had recognized the burden of raising 3 toddlers and generously provided the exact financial resources needed to hire a qualified full-time nanny. But Nia and my mother never hired a nanny. They never paid a professional. Instead, they forced me to do it. They used the heavy, suffocating rhetoric of family loyalty and cultural obligation to chain me to the house. They told me I owed them. They screamed that Black families only survive by sacrificing for each other. They made me feel selfish and westernized for wanting a career, all while they were quietly intercepting a massive influx of cash. My fingers flew across the trackpad as I opened statement after statement, tracing the outflows of that $4,000. The money never went toward the children's development. It did not go toward household groceries or utility bills. On the 4th of the month, exactly 2 days after the in-laws' wire transfer cleared, an automatic payment of $1,200 was deducted by a luxury auto financing company for Trevor's pristine Porsche. The rest of the funds were scattered across high-end designer boutiques, expensive hair salons, luxury day spas, and lavish restaurant tabs. They were pocketing the nanny fund to subsidize a fake, luxurious lifestyle they could not actually afford. Trevor got to drive a status symbol. Nia got to parade around the suburbs with designer handbags. My mother got a steady stream of kickbacks and spa days. And I got nothing but exhaustion, manipulation, and the threat of homelessness. The sheer calculated evil of their arrangement hit me with the force of a freight train. When I announced my new $75,000 corporate job at the dinner table, they did not panic because I was breaking a sacred family tradition. They panicked because their free indentured servant was quitting. If I stopped watching the children, Nia and Trevor would be forced to actually hire the premium nanny his parents were paying for. That meant the $4,000 of disposable luxury income would instantly vanish. The Porsche lease would default. The designer shopping sprees would end. The entire financial house of cards they had built on my back would collapse. I slowly leaned back against my bar stool. The anger I felt the night I was kicked out was nothing compared to the cold, lethal clarity washing over me right now. They thought they had discarded a weak, dependent girl. They did not realize they had just handed a professional financial auditor the exact paper trail needed to completely annihilate their fraudulent empire. I downloaded every single file saved them to an encrypted external drive and smiled. I had found my weapon. By the 7th week of my absence, the reality of paying for actual childcare hit Nia and Trevor like a concrete wall. They had scrambled to hire a professional nanny named Sarah to keep up appearances. Sarah was highly qualified, fully certified, and crucially completely unaware of the toxic dynamics she was stepping into. Nia had likely hired her expecting the same dynamic she had with me, a silent, obedient servant who would absorb her stress and manage the entire household for a flat lowball rate, while Nia and my mother continued to skim the rest of the in-laws' money. But Sarah was a professional who knew her exact worth and strictly operated by the letter of her contract. The clash was inevitable. Through my burner social media accounts and the reliable gossip network of Aunt Vivian, I had a front row seat to the spectacular implosion of their childcare arrangement. Nia could not comprehend that a professional employee would not simply bend to her every whim. She started treating Sarah exactly the way she had treated me. She demanded that Sarah stay 2 hours past her scheduled shift without offering overtime pay because Nia simply had to attend a last-minute networking dinner. She expected Sarah to do the adults' laundry, scrub the kitchen floors, and run personal errands that were entirely outside the scope of basic childcare. When Sarah politely reminded Nia of her contractual boundaries, Nia took it as a personal insult. She had spent years conditioning me to accept her abuse, and she fundamentally lacked the emotional intelligence to understand that outside the walls of our family home, her authority meant absolutely nothing. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Nia had spent the morning at a luxury day spa, a habit funded by the remaining scraps of the stolen nanny fund. She arrived home 3 hours late. Sarah had a hard stop at 5 o'clock because she had her own family to get to. When Nia finally strolled through the front door at 8 o'clock carrying shopping bags and an iced coffee, she did not apologize. Instead, she looked at the kitchen sink, which had a few plates left in it from the children's dinner, and immediately snapped. According to the dramatic retelling my mother later cried about to the church prayer group, Nia unleashed a massive screaming fit. She yelled at Sarah, calling her lazy and incompetent, demanding to know why the house was not spotless. She expected Sarah to cower and apologize the way I always had. Sarah did not flinch. She calmly picked up her purse, handed Nia the house keys, and stated that she was quitting effective immediately due to a hostile work environment and unpaid wages. Nia tried to block the door, threatening to ruin Sarah's reputation in the suburban mom groups. Sarah simply pulled out her phone and threatened to call the police for unlawful detainment. Nia panicked and backed away, letting the only lifeline she had walk right out the front door. When Trevor pulled into the driveway an hour later, the scene he walked into was nothing short of apocalyptic. I could picture it perfectly. Trevor, exhausted and irritated from a long day of pretending to be a tech visionary, opening his expensive mahogany front door to pure unadulterated chaos. The three toddlers, completely dysregulated from the sudden departure of their caretaker, and the explosive screaming match, were running through the house crying hysterically. Dinner was nowhere to be found. The television was blaring, and sitting in the middle of the living room floor amid discarded designer shopping bags was Nia having a full-blown hysterical meltdown. The illusion of their perfect affluent marriage cracked and shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the expensive Persian rug. Trevor did not offer comfort. He did not gently pull his wife into his arms and tell her they would figure it out together. Instead, he exploded. He screamed at Nia for being incapable of managing a simple household. He demanded to know how she managed to drive away a highly paid professional in less than a month. I was furious, not just because the house was a disaster, but because this failure threatened his carefully crafted image. Nia screamed back, blaming the nanny, blaming the children, blaming the stress of her lifestyle, and finally, as always, blaming me. She wailed that none of this would be happening if Kiara had just stayed where she belonged. She shrieked that I had maliciously destroyed their family by walking away. But Trevor was not interested in hearing about me. I was staring at the fresh designer shopping bags scattered around his sobbing wife, realizing that while his home was falling apart, Nia was still desperately spending money they no longer had the bandwidth to waste. Their fight escalated to a volume that alarmed the entire cul-de-sac. The pristine, carefully manicured image of the wealthy, successful tech couple was dead. They were just two deeply entitled, incredibly selfish people who had suddenly run out of victims to exploit. Trevor realized in that moment that his wife was not the effortless domestic goddess she pretended to be on social media. Nia realized her husband was not a supportive partner, but a demanding boss who expected a flawless life without lifting a single finger to help build it. The foundation of their relationship was built entirely on my stolen labor, and without me propping it up, they were completely collapsing under the weight of their own manufactured reality. They could not call his parents to complain, because that would risk exposing the reality of the premium nanny fund they were siphoning. They were trapped in a prison of their own design, forced to finally face the grueling, relentless reality of the life they had chosen to build. Sitting in my quiet, peaceful apartment miles away, I did not feel a single ounce of pity. They had forged their own chains. Now they were finally being forced to wear them. Every scream, every tear, every moment of panic they were currently experiencing was simply the universe balancing the scales. The bill for my years of unpaid labor had finally come due, and they were entirely bankrupt. My phone buzzed against the cool quartz of my kitchen island, precisely at 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening. I was reviewing a complex risk assessment file for Vanguard Capital, sipping a glass of imported sparkling water, when the screen lit up with a familiar, dreaded name. Mom. It had been exactly 7 weeks since she had thrown my bags onto the damp suburban grass. 7 weeks of absolute silence, broken only by the flying monkeys she had dispatched to do her dirty work. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the device vibrate across the smooth countertop. A part of me, the wounded 22-year-old girl who still secretly craved her mother's approval, wanted to let it go to voicemail. But the new Kiara, the financial analyst, who routinely dismantled multi-million-dollar portfolios for a living, picked up the phone and pressed accept. I did not say hello. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited for her to play her opening card. Kiara Danielle. My mother's voice blasted through the speaker, entirely bypassing any form of basic human greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I had a safe place to sleep or food to eat. She spoke with the breathless, frantic energy of a woman whose carefully constructed universe was rapidly catching fire. You need to come home right now. Your sister is falling apart, and you are going to be the reason this family breaks. I leaned back against my bar stool, my expression completely blank. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill the uncomfortable void. When I did not offer the usual compliant apology, her tone shifted from frantic to authoritarian. Did you hear me speaking to you? Trevor is packing his bags, Kiara. He is talking about leaving your sister because she cannot manage the children without help. Nia is having a complete nervous breakdown in the master bedroom, and the babies are terrified. You need to call your boss tomorrow morning and request an immediate leave of absence. Tell them you have a family emergency. You need to come back here and fix this before Trevor calls a divorce lawyer. The sheer blinding audacity of her demand actually made me pause. There was zero accountability. There was absolutely no apology for kicking me out into the street. She was calling me at my luxury apartment, demanding that I sabotage a $75,000 corporate career to go clean up the mess she and Nia had created. She expected me to abandon my financial independence to save a marriage built entirely on my stolen labor. And she delivered this demand with the supreme unearned confidence of a matriarch who fully believed she owned my future. You are listening to me, right? She snapped, her voice growing sharper. This is what family does, Kiara. We step up when things get hard. Your sister needs you to step up. A deep rumbling sound started in the back of my throat. It bubbled up through my chest, escaping my lips before I could even try to stop it. I started laughing. It was not a nervous chuckle or a polite giggle. It was a loud, rich, genuine laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of my living room. I laughed at the absolute delusion of her request. I laughed at the desperation in her voice. I laughed because the invisible chains she had used to control me my entire life had completely evaporated. "What is so funny?" she screeched, her voice hitting an incredibly shrill pitch. "Your sister's marriage is crumbling and you think this is a joke." I stopped laughing, taking a slow, measured breath. "I think it is absolutely hilarious, Mom," I said, my voice cold and smooth like polished glass. "I think it is hilarious that you threw me out on the street for prioritizing my career, and now you are begging me to save your golden child from the consequences of her own incompetence. Nia does not have a childcare emergency. She has a management problem. You two have been siphoning $4,000 a month from Trevor's parents for a premium nanny service. If Nia cannot manage her household, she needs to take that stolen luxury fund and hire a professional. Because my hourly rate is currently far outside of your budget." My mother gasped, a sharp intake of breath, indicating that she realized I knew about the secret money. "How dare you," she started, but I did not let her finish. "You told me to quit by Sunday or find somewhere else to sleep," I reminded her, cutting through her impending hysterics. "I found somewhere else to sleep. Now you and Nia can find somewhere else to get your free labor. Have a wonderful evening, Mom." I pressed the red button, disconnecting the call. I tossed the phone back onto the kitchen island and picked up my pen, returning my attention directly to my risk assessment file. Exactly 12 minutes later, my phone chimed with a text message. It was not from my mother, it was from Trevor. The message was a massive block of text dripping with the toxic, unhinged entitlement of a man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. "You think you are so smart, you arrogant little brat," the message read. "Your mother is in tears, and Nia is inconsolable because you want to act like a selfish, westernized feminist who does not care about family. You owe us. We gave you a place to stay while you studied. You owe my wife your respect and your time. You are going to regret hanging up on your mother and leaving my wife in this situation. You clearly need someone to teach you a lesson about respect and how the real world works. If you do not show up at this house by tomorrow morning to help your sister, I am going to make sure you learn that lesson the hard way. Do not test me, Kiara. I know people." I read the message twice, analyzing the poorly veiled threat. Trevor was a mid-level tech manager with a massive ego and a fragile temper. He genuinely believed that his status as the wealthy white son-in-law gave him the ultimate authority to discipline me. He thought his corporate connections and his inflated bank account made him untouchable. He assumed that because I was a young black woman fresh out of college, I would naturally be intimidated by his aggressive posturing. I wanted to scare me back into my designated place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I did not reply to his text. Instead, I took a screenshot of the threatening message and emailed it directly to my personal backup drive. Trevor had just handed me a loaded gun. He was threatening to teach me a lesson and implying he would use his professional network to do it. He was completely unaware that he had just documented his own malicious intent. I locked my phone and smiled, sipping my sparkling water. Trevor wanted a war, and he was foolish enough to put his declaration in writing. I had absolutely no idea who he was dealing with anymore. The following Tuesday morning began just like any other at Vanguard Capital, but the quiet hum of the trading floor was hiding a rapidly approaching storm. Trevor had spent the weekend stewing in his own massive, fragile ego. His threat to teach me a lesson was not just empty posturing. It was a promise built on the terrifyingly common reality of wealthy, entitled men using their corporate leverage to destroy women who dare to defy them. He remembered the name of my firm from that fateful Sunday dinner, and he weaponized his premium networking accounts to bypass the main switchboard and directly locate the contact information for Vanguard Capital's head of human resources. Trevor made the call at exactly 9 in the morning. I later learned from the official incident report that he completely leaned into his practiced authoritative corporate voice. He introduced himself as my concerned brother-in-law, a fellow executive in the Atlanta tech sphere, just looking out for the integrity of a partner institution. He painted a masterful, horrifying picture of a deeply disturbed young woman. I told the human resources director that I had suffered a severe mental break, that I had been violently evicted from my parents' home due to erratic behavior, and most maliciously, that I had stolen a significant amount of money from my family before disappearing. He suggested with fake, heavy-hearted reluctance that granting me access to sensitive financial data was a massive liability for Vanguard Capital. He expertly used corporate buzzwords like fiduciary risk and behavioral instability to trigger every single alarm bell a human resources department possesses. At 10:15, my desk phone chimed. It was a direct message from Evelyn, my managing director, telling me to come to the executive conference room immediately. The instruction was brief and lacked her usual professional warmth. I locked my computer, smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, and walked down the long glass hallway. I did not feel fear. I felt a hyper-focused, cold anticipation. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, I was greeted by an incredibly tense atmosphere. Evelyn was seated at the head of the long mahogany table with her hands clasped tightly together. Next to her sat Marcus, the lead human resources director, looking profoundly uncomfortable. They motioned for me to sit down. Marcus cleared his throat and slid a manila folder across the table. He explained in a very careful, measured tone that the firm had received a highly disturbing phone call regarding my personal integrity and mental stability. He stated that while Vanguard Capital typically ignores outside personal disputes, the specific allegations of theft and financial instability required an immediate internal review. I did not gasp. I did not start crying or frantically defending my character. I simply sat back in the leather ergonomic chair, crossed my legs, and looked directly at Marcus. I asked one simple question in a completely steady voice. Did the caller happen to identify himself as a tech manager named Trevor? Marcus looked mildly surprised and exchanged a quick glance with Evelyn. Yes, he did, Marcus confirmed. He claimed to be your brother-in-law and expressed deep concern about your recent actions, including an alleged theft of family funds. A cool, profound sense of calm washed over my entire body. Trevor had actually done it. He had handed me the exact rope required to hang his own professional reputation. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my company-issued tablet. I placed it on the mahogany table. I understand why Vanguard takes allegations of financial theft seriously. I began, my voice ringing with absolute professional clarity. However, what you received this morning was not a whistleblower report. It was a documented campaign of harassment and retaliation by a man who is furious that I recently stopped providing free full-time childcare for his family. I opened my tablet and pulled up the screenshot of the text message Trevor had sent me the previous night. I turned the screen toward Evelyn and Marcus. I would like to officially submit this into my human resources file, I said. This is a text message from Trevor sent to my personal phone at 8:12 last night. In it, he explicitly threatens to teach me a lesson and implies he will use his corporate connections to punish me simply because I refused his demand to take a leave of absence to babysit his children. Marcus leaned forward, reading the hostile, aggressive block of text. Evelyn narrowed her eyes, her sharp instincts instantly kicking in. I then pulled up my own financial audit reports, the exact ones Evelyn had praised just days prior. Furthermore, I continued, I invite you to conduct a full forensic audit of my background, my credit score, and my banking history. You will find absolutely zero evidence of theft, debt, or financial instability. What you will find is a 22-year-old woman who secured her own luxury apartment and maintained a flawless work record while actively escaping a financially abusive family dynamic. Trevor called you because he wanted to weaponize my employment to force me back into domestic servitude. He attempted to use your human resources department as a tool for his own personal extortion. The heavy tension in the conference room instantly shattered, replacing the suspicion with profound corporate outrage. Evelyn, the fierce black woman who had climbed her way to the top of a notoriously ruthless industry, looked at the threatening text message and then looked at me. She recognized exactly what was happening. She had likely seen entitled men try to crush ambitious young women countless times before. Her posture shifted from investigative to highly protective. Marcus sat back in his chair, shaking his head in absolute disgust. This is a severe breach of professional conduct on his part, Marcus stated firmly. Calling an employer to make false defamatory statements about an employee is tortious interference. Kiara, I apologize that you had to deal with this harassment in our office. We will immediately close this inquiry, and I will personally flag his contact information to ensure our switchboard automatically rejects any future communication from him or anyone claiming to be your family. Thank you, Marcus, I replied smoothly, but I would actually prefer if you documented the exact contents of his call. His false allegations of theft might prove highly relevant in the very near future. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and gave me a long, assessing look. She saw right through my calm exterior to the calculated tactical warfare happening underneath. You handled this ambush with remarkable composure, Kiara, she said, her voice dropping into a register of deep professional respect. You did not let a malicious lie derail your focus. You brought data. You brought proof. That is exactly the kind of unshakable temperament I need on my team. I nodded, accepting the validation without missing a beat. I survived the corporate assassination attempt not by fighting fire with fire, but by dropping an iceberg onto the flames. Trevor thought his status as an older, wealthy tech executive would automatically grant him credibility over a young entry-level analyst. He fundamentally misunderstood the environment he was trying to manipulate. In the world of high-stakes finance, data is the absolute king, and emotional manipulation is an immediate liability. I walked out of that conference room feeling practically invincible. Trevor had just fired his absolute best shot and the bullet had completely bounced off my armor. But the absolute best part of the meeting had not even happened yet. Trevor had no idea that by calling Vanguard Capital, he had just blindly stumbled into the most devastating trap imaginable. I turned toward the heavy glass door of the conference room, fully intending to return to my desk and resume my day. I had just dismantled my brother-in-law's malicious attack with effortless precision, and the adrenaline was humming pleasantly in my veins. But before my hand could grasp the metal handle, Evelyn spoke again. Her voice was much lower now, stripped of the standard corporate formality. It held a dangerous, razor-sharp edge. "Wait a moment, Kiara," Evelyn commanded. She picked up her tablet and began tapping the screen with rapid, intense movements. Marcus paused halfway out of his chair, watching our managing director with curious eyes. Evelyn's brow furrowed as she scrolled through a highly secure internal database. When she finally looked up, a slow, lethal smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted blood in the water. "What was the exact name of Trevor's tech company?" Evelyn asked, leaning back in her leather chair and crossing her arms. I blinked momentarily, thrown off by the question. "Nexus Cloud Solutions," I replied. "He is their vice president of operations and product development." Evelyn let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the glass walls. She turned her tablet around and slid it across the mahogany table toward me. I walked back over and looked down at the bright screen. Displayed in high resolution was a massive, highly confidential pitch deck. The title page featured the Nexus Cloud Solutions logo in bold blue lettering. Right beneath it was a funding request for a Series B investment round, totaling $25 million. I stared at the screen, my mind racing to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what I was looking at. Vanguard Capital was the primary investment firm reviewing their funding pitch. Trevor had just blindly called the exact financial institution that held the absolute survival of his entire company in its hands. They submitted their preliminary financials to our growth division 3 weeks ago. Evelyn explained, tapping a manicured fingernail against the edge of the table. They are desperate for capital, Kiara. Their burn rate is catastrophic, and their current venture partners are threatening to pull out if they do not secure a major institutional backer by the end of the quarter. Vanguard Capital is their absolute last lifeline. I slowly looked up from the tablet, meeting Evelyn's fierce, dark eyes. The universe was not just balancing the scales anymore. It was handing me the entire courtroom. Evelyn stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. "In this industry, we evaluate risk every single day," she said, her voice echoing with absolute authority. We look at market trends, algorithm viability, and user acquisition. But the single most dangerous liability a startup can possess is a leadership team completely devoid of basic integrity. If a vice president is willing to commit tortious interference, weaponize his corporate title, and actively attempt to destroy the livelihood of a 22-year-old black woman over a petty domestic dispute, he is fundamentally unfit to manage $25 million of my client's money. If he is financially and morally bankrupt in his personal life, he is guaranteed to be hiding toxic rot inside his company. She turned away from the window and walked directly back to me. I need a lead forensic analyst to conduct the deep dive audit on the Nexus Cloud Solutions portfolio. Evelyn stated, her gaze locking onto mine with intense, blazing purpose. I need someone who will not be swayed by their flashy tech jargon. I need someone who will rip their financial projections apart line by line, cross-reference every single expense, and expose exactly how much money they are bleeding. Are you up for the assignment, Kiara? The air in the room grew completely still. Evelyn knew exactly what she was doing. She was a woman who had fought tooth and nail to break through the glass ceiling of the finance world, and she recognized the deeply entrenched entitlement of men like Trevor. She was giving me the ultimate weapon to not only protect myself, but to professionally obliterate the man who had just tried to ruin my life. I did not hesitate. I looked at the pitch deck and then straight back at my managing director. I will uncover every single hidden liability in their ledger, I promised, my voice ringing with cold, absolute certainty. I will dismantle their valuation model by the end of the week. Evelyn nodded, her smile widening into something genuinely terrifying. The file will be transferred to your secure drive in 10 minutes, she said. Do not leave a single stone unturned. I walked out of the executive boardroom feeling like I was floating. The power shift was so absolute, so structurally devastating, that it almost felt surreal. Trevor had threatened to teach me a lesson about how the real world works. He believed his status protected him. He thought he could pull strings from his suburban mansion and crush me with a single phone call. He was so blinded by his own toxic arrogance that he never bothered to research exactly which investment firm I worked for. When I sat down at my desk, the massive data dump from Nexus Cloud Solutions arrived in my inbox. I opened the first encrypted folder and cracked my knuckles. For the next 3 days, I did not just work. I went to war. I applied the exact same ruthless forensic scrutiny to Trevor's corporate financials that I had applied to his stolen nanny fund. The parallels were absolutely breathtaking. Trevor ran his division the exact same way he ran his household on smoke mirrors and other people's money. I uncovered vastly inflated revenue projections, heavily bloated expense accounts for executive travel, and severe misallocations of research funds. He was driving a luxury Porsche on his in-laws' dime while actively sinking his own company through chronic mismanagement. How was a fraud in his personal life and a massive liability in his professional one? I compiled my findings into a brutal, airtight 50-page dossier. I highlighted every single red flag, every inflated metric, and every instance of gross financial negligence. I built a mathematical guillotine, and I polished the blade until it gleamed. Trevor was currently sitting in his chaotic, messy house screaming at his wife and completely convinced he had just successfully gotten me fired. I had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding the financial life support cord to his entire career, and I was preparing to yank it straight out of the wall. The stage was perfectly set for the ultimate collision. 10 weeks. That is exactly how long it took for the stage to be perfectly set for the final act. It was the second Saturday in August, the day of my parents' highly publicized 30th wedding anniversary cookout. In my family, an anniversary party was never just a celebration of marital longevity. It was a fiercely competitive status symbol, a meticulously choreographed performance designed to prove to the entire church congregation and the extended family that Darlene and my father were the undisputed patriarch and matriarch of a flawless, thriving dynasty. But this particular cookout carried stakes that were astronomically higher than any event they had hosted before. The guest list included the usual suspects like Aunt Vivian and the neighborhood gossips, but the true guests of honor were Trevor's parents. Charles and Catherine were old money conservative and deeply judgmental. They lived in a sprawling estate in Connecticut and carried themselves with the quiet, impenetrable arrogance of people who had never been told no in their entire lives. They had flown down to Atlanta specifically for this anniversary, and their presence in my parents' suburban backyard was the ultimate prize for my mother. Through the predictable and relentless stream of Aunt Vivian's public social media updates, I had a front row seat to the absolute circus happening at my childhood home. I sat at the quartz island of my downtown apartment sipping an iced matcha and watching the digital broadcast of their desperation. Darlene and Nia were bending over backwards, contorting themselves into pretzels to impress Charles and Catherine. The theme of the afternoon was clearly the perfect, tightly knit, affluent family, but the reality bubbling just beneath the surface was a pressure cooker of sheer, unadulterated panic. I could see it in every single photo and video clip posted online. My mother was wearing a rigid, strained smile as she paraded Charles and Catherine around the patio, introducing them to church members as her VIP guests. She was desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy, sophisticated matriarch, but her eyes betrayed a frantic, nervous energy. She knew the entire facade was resting on a fragile foundation. She was terrified that the wealthy in-laws would look too closely at the frayed edges of Nia's life. Nia herself looked like she was teetering on the absolute edge of a massive psychological breakdown. In the background of one of Aunt Vivian's live streams, I caught a glimpse of my older sister trying to manage her 3 toddlers. The professional nanny had quit weeks ago, and the replacements Nia had frantically tried to hire had all fled from her toxic attitude and refusal to pay fair wages. Now, with her wealthy mother-in-law scrutinizing her every move, Nia was forced to actually parent her own children while simultaneously playing the role of the effortless high society hostess. She was wearing a designer sundress that was already stained with juice. Her hair was frizzing in the oppressive Atlanta humidity, and her signature smug smirk had been completely replaced by a look of sheer hunted desperation. She had to keep the children quiet, clean, and perfectly behaved to maintain the illusion that the premium nanny service Charles and Catherine were funding every single month was actually doing its job. Every time one of the toddlers screamed or threw a toy, you could practically see the terror flash across Nia's face. She was terrified that Catherine would ask where the professional help was. She was terrified the lie would unravel right there on the freshly manicured lawn. Trevor was not faring any better. He was standing near the expensive outdoor grill holding a craft beer and attempting to hold court with my father and a few uncles. On the surface, he was playing the role of the successful, wealthy tech executive providing for his beautiful family. But I knew the truth. I had spent the last several days completely dissecting his company's financial portfolio. I knew his startup was bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate. I knew his venture partners were threatening to walk. I knew his entire career was hanging by a single fraying thread that I currently held in my hands. In the photos, Trevor looked haggard. He had dark circles under his eyes and his posture was rigid. He was smiling for the cameras, but he was sweating from more than just the Georgia heat. I was a man waiting for the financial guillotine to drop, completely unaware that the executioner was the 22-year-old sister-in-law he had just tried to get fired. The sheer hypocrisy of the entire event was breathtaking. Here was a family that preached the sacred gospel of loyalty and sticking together, actively celebrating their unity, while they had violently thrown their youngest daughter out onto the street. They were eating catered barbecue and drinking expensive wine funded by lies, extortion, and stolen money. They had built a glittering monument to their own vanity, and they felt entirely safe doing it because they believed I had been successfully neutralized. They thought I was hiding in shame, too broken and intimidated by Trevor's corporate threats to ever show my face again. They assumed my absence was a permanent victory. I locked my phone and stood up from my kitchen island. I walked into my spacious walk-in closet and let my hands trail over the row of pristine professional and designer clothes I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. I selected a stunning tailored jumpsuit in a bold, striking shade of crimson. It was not a dress for hiding. It was armor for a conqueror. I paired it with a flawless pair of nude heels and my favorite gold jewelry. I took my time with my makeup, ensuring every single detail was absolutely immaculate. I did not want to look like a survivor. I wanted to look like an apex predator. As I grabbed my keys and my designer handbag, I felt a profound sense of calm settle over my entire body. I was not nervous. I was not angry. I was operating with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon about to remove a cancerous tumor. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. The 30-minute drive from my luxury downtown high-rise to the quiet tree-lined streets of my parents' suburban neighborhood felt like a victory lap. I pulled my brand-new sleek car onto their street, listening to the faint sounds of upbeat music and loud laughter drifting over the tall wooden fences. They were having the time of their lives, completely oblivious to the fact that the invisible stagehand they had abused, exploited and discarded was about to walk right through the front door and burn the entire theater to the absolute ground. I pulled the sleek, polished frame of my brand new luxury sedan onto the crowded suburban street, parking it directly behind my father's aging pickup truck. The deep metallic paint caught the afternoon sun, gleaming like a newly minted coin. I turned off the ignition and sat in the cool, air-conditioned cabin for a brief second, listening to the heavy bass of old-school rhythm and blues thumping through the warm Georgia air. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, ensuring my crimson jumpsuit was perfectly draped and my posture radiated absolute authority. I stepped out of the car, the sharp click of my designer heels immediately announcing my presence on the concrete driveway. The scent of hickory smoke and roasted meat hung thick in the humid air, a deceptive blanket of suburban comfort covering a family built entirely on lies. I walked slowly up the driveway, bypassing the front door and heading straight for the side gate that led to the sprawling backyard. My heart did not race. My palms did not sweat. I felt an exhilarating, icy calm settling deep into my bones. I pushed open the heavy wooden gate and stepped onto the freshly manicured lawn. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely cinematic. I did not need to shout or make a grand announcement. The sheer visual impact of my arrival did all the heavy lifting. I was supposed to be a destitute runaway, a broken young woman sleeping in gutters after being rightfully cast out by a loving family. Instead, I looked like a young executive who had just bought the entire neighborhood. Aunt Vivian was the first to spot me. She was standing near the buffet tables holding a paper plate piled high with potato salad mid-sentence in what was likely a loud, gossipy story. Her mouth physically dropped open. The paper plate tilted dangerously in her hands. She nudged my cousin, who turned and gasped. Like a line of rapid-fire dominoes, the realization of my presence swept across the patio. The loud, boisterous conversations began to die out in clusters. Even the Uncle manning the massive grill turned around, completely forgetting the ribs he was supposed to be flipping. The music did not actually stop, but the overwhelming hush that fell over the 50-plus guests made the upbeat song sound suddenly hollow and completely out of place. The aunties and older church members immediately leaned into each other, their eyes darting rapidly up and down my expensive outfit. I could hear the frantic hissing of their whispers cutting through the humid air. "Is that Kiara? I thought Darlene said she was practically homeless. Look at those shoes, that is not the outfit of a girl drowning in debt." They were staring at a ghost who had returned, draped in gold, and it was completely short-circuiting the carefully crafted narrative my mother had spent the last 10 weeks drilling into their heads. Across the yard, near the expensive patio furniture, where Trevor was trying to impress his wealthy white parents, stood Nia. She had a squirming toddler balanced on her hip, and a fixed, strained smile plastered across her exhausted face. When she saw the crowd turning, she followed their gaze. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, the blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and entirely panic-stricken. I offered her a slow, deliberate smile. Nia practically dropped the toddler into the arms of a nearby cousin and sprinted across the lawn. She did not walk. She power-walked, with a frantic, jerky desperation that completely shattered her elegant hostess persona. She shoved past two church elders, nearly tripping over the hem of her stained designer sundress, to reach me before I could take another step toward the main gathering area. When she reached me, she did not offer a greeting. She lunged forward and clamped her hand around my forearm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. Her eyes were wide and wild, filled with an untamed primal terror. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a strangled, frantic whisper. Her breath smelled heavily of white wine and sheer panic. You need to leave. You need to turn around and walk right back out that gate this exact second, Kiara. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm and then looked directly into her terrified eyes. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply raised a single perfect eyebrow. Let go of my arm, Nia. I said, my voice low, smooth, and carrying a dangerous edge of absolute authority. She released my arm as if she had just touched a hot stove, but she did not step back. She stepped closer, physically trying to block my path to the rest of the yard, her body trembling with anxiety. You cannot be here, she begged, her voice cracking under the immense pressure of her crumbling reality. Trevor's parents are sitting right over there. Charles and Catherine flew in just for this. They cannot see you. They cannot talk to you. You are going to ruin everything. I tilted my head, feigning innocent confusion. Why on earth would my presence ruin your perfect anniversary party? I asked calmly. I am just a devoted daughter coming to celebrate her parents' 30 years of marital bliss. Surely Charles and Catherine would love to meet Trevor's brilliant, successful sister-in-law. Nia's face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate horror. She looked over her shoulder, terrified that her wealthy in-laws were watching our exchange. No, you do not understand, she whispered frantically, the words spilling out of her mouth in a rapid, chaotic stream. We told them you were gone. We had to explain why you were not living here helping with the kids anymore. Trevor told his parents that you developed a massive gambling addiction. We told them you stole money from mom and dad to pay off dangerous loan sharks and that you ran away to hide from the debt collectors. If they see you looking like this, if they talk to you, they will know we made it all up. You have to leave before they recognize you. I stared at her, letting the sheer magnitude of her malicious, sickening lie hang heavily in the air between us. They had not just told the church I was a party girl. They had told the people funding their lifestyle that I was a criminal, a gambling addict, and a thief. They had completely assassinated my character to Charles and Catherine, simply to cover up the fact that I had refused to be their unpaid domestic slave. They needed a desperate, unhinged excuse for why the built-in babysitter disappeared, and they happily threw my entire reputation directly under the bus to get it. I looked at my older sister, watching a bead of sweat slowly roll down the side of her panicked face. She was expecting me to run away in shame. She was expecting me to be horrified by the lie and retreat to protect myself from the judgment of her wealthy in-laws. She was still operating under the delusion that she held the power to intimidate me. I reached out and gently brushed a stray frizzy curl away from Nia's sweating forehead, mimicking the exact same condescending maternal gesture she had used on me for years. A gambling addiction, I repeated, letting a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. That is a fascinating narrative, Nia. It is incredibly creative. But I think it is time Charles and Catherine met the real Kiara. I stepped effortlessly around her, completely ignoring her strangled gasp of protest. I walked straight past the whispering aunties, past the bewildered church members, and headed directly toward the expensive patio furniture where Trevor's wealthy parents were sitting. The final act had officially begun, and I was about to deliver a performance they would never forget. I moved across the freshly cut grass with the deliberate, measured pace of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. The guests parted like the Red Sea, allowing me a clear path toward the shaded patio where Trevor and his wealthy parents sat sipping their iced drinks. I could feel the collective gaze of 50 people burning into my back, but my focus remained locked on my destination. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue smoke and expensive perfume, but underneath it all lay the unmistakable scent of impending disaster. Before I could reach the edge of the stone patio, a solid, imposing figure stepped directly into my path. It was Aunt Vivian. She had abandoned her plate of potato salad and marched over with a look of thunderous, righteous fury on her face. Vivian had always considered herself the moral enforcer of our extended family, the loud, booming voice that kept the younger generation in line through public humiliation and shame. She planted her feet firmly blocking my way and crossed her arms over her chest. "Where exactly do you think you are going, little girl?" Vivian barked, her voice deliberately loud enough to ensure every single person in the backyard could hear her. The ambient chatter of the party immediately ceased. Every eye turned toward our confrontation. I stopped 2 feet away, maintaining perfect posture. I am going to greet my brother-in-law and his parents, I replied in a conversational tone completely devoid of fear. It is a family celebration after all. Vivian let out a harsh, mocking laugh that scraped against the tense silence of the yard. Family, she scoffed, stepping closer to me, her face twisting in disgust. You lost the right to use that word the night you robbed your parents blind. You have nerve showing up wearing those fancy clothes, acting like somebody important. We know the truth, Kiara. We know what you did and why you ran away like a coward in the middle of the night. I did not flinch or raise my voice to match hers. I tilted my head, looking at her with polite curiosity. And what exactly is the truth? Aunt Vivian, I asked, my voice ringing clear across the lawn. Please enlighten me. I would love to hear which version of my life story my mother is broadcasting to the church prayer group. Vivian gestured wildly with her hands, her voice rising another octave, playing directly to her captive audience. Do not stand there and play innocent with me, she yelled. Your mother told us everything. We know about your gambling addiction. We know you stole from the savings account set up for your sister's children to pay off dirty debts. You abandoned your family and left Nia struggling to raise 3 babies alone because you could not control your selfish, greedy impulses. You are a disgrace to this family and the church. Turn around, walk out that gate, and never come back until you are ready to beg for forgiveness. The silence following her outburst was heavy and absolute. The aunties and uncles watched me, waiting for an inevitable breakdown, waiting for me to cry, run away, or scream in defensive rage. That was the chaotic, messy drama they were used to from my mother's side of the family. Instead, I smiled a slow, incredibly sharp smile. I looked down at my pristine crimson designer jumpsuit, my flawless leather heels, and the heavy gold watch on my wrist. Then I looked back at Vivian, who was wearing a stained floral dress and sweating profusely in the afternoon heat. A gambling addiction, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with cool amusement. Stealing from my sister's children, running from loan sharks. That is quite the cinematic narrative, Aunt Vivian. But I have to ask a logical question. I gestured casually to my outfit and the expensive car key resting in my manicured hand. Do I look like a destitute gambling addict on the run? Does a woman drowning in dangerous debt show up, driving a brand new luxury sedan and wearing a highly coveted designer outfit? Vivian opened her mouth to retort, but faltered, her eyes involuntarily tracking the undeniable wealth radiating from my appearance. The crowd of relatives murmured, shifting uncomfortably. The cognitive dissonance was hitting them. The story they had been fed did not match the reality standing right in front of them. You see, Aunt Vivian, I continued, my voice slicing through her confusion with surgical precision. The problem with blindly believing everything my mother says is that eventually the lies become too massive to sustain. I did not steal a single dime from this family. I was kicked out of this house at 11 o'clock at night with nothing but my suitcases, simply because I refused to be Nia's unpaid live-in maid anymore. I secured a $75,000 corporate job, and my mother threw me out because my employment interfered with her demand for free childcare. I left and built an incredibly successful life for myself. Lies, Vivian sputtered, though her booming voice had lost its confident edge. Your mother would never lie about something so serious. She was crying in church, Kiara. My mother cries when the grocery store runs out of her favorite wine, I replied smoothly, effortlessly deflecting her hostility. Tears are her currency, but numbers are mine. And right now the numbers are about to destroy every single lie this family has been hiding behind. I could see the exact moment the tide turned. The whispers among the guests shifted from condemnation to genuine, bewildered curiosity. The stark, glaring contrast between Vivian's loud, messy hostility and my unshakable, sophisticated calm was exposing the toxic dysfunction of my family to everyone present. I was not the unstable runaway they had been gossiping about. I was a poised, successful professional standing her ground against a bully. The commotion had successfully achieved its secondary purpose. The loud voices and the sudden gathering of the crowd had finally drawn the attention of the guests of honor. Across the yard at the shaded patio table, Charles and Catherine had stopped sipping their iced drinks. They stood up, their faces displaying a mix of aristocratic confusion and mild distaste at the public spectacle. Trevor stood up right beside them, his face draining of all color as he finally recognized the woman in the crimson jumpsuit standing in the center of the lawn. He looked like a man staring directly into the headlights of an oncoming freight train. "What is going on over here?" Charles asked, his deep, booming voice carrying across the grass as he and Catherine began walking toward the center of the yard. Trevor trailed behind them, frantically looking around for Nia, who was currently hiding behind a group of cousins completely paralyzed by fear. I turned my attention away from Aunt Vivian, leaving her speechless and sputtering in my wake. I squared my shoulders, taking a deep breath of the smoke-filled air, and turned to face Trevor's approaching parents. The defensive line had been broken. The stage was mine. The absolute destruction of their fraudulent suburban empire was about to commence. Charles and Catherine moved through the parted crowd with the slow, deliberate grace of people who expected the world to automatically make way for them. They did not rush. They did not look alarmed. They simply approached the epicenter of the disruption with a mild, aristocratic curiosity that made my parents' entire neighborhood look like a trivial backdrop to their existence. Charles wore a crisp linen shirt and khakis that screamed coastal wealth, while Catherine looked effortlessly immaculate in a tailored silk dress that was entirely too formal for a backyard barbecue. Behind them, Trevor was practically jogging to keep up. His face had transitioned from pale shock to a deep, splotchy red. He kept reaching out as if to grab his father's arm and steer him away, but he lacked the actual courage to physically stop his parents from engaging with me. He knew that any sudden aggressive movement would only draw more suspicion, so he hovered helplessly in their wake, his eyes darting frantically toward the patio, where Naya was currently gripping the back of a plastic chair so tightly her knuckles were translucent. When they finally stopped in front of me, the height difference was negligible because of my heels, but the power dynamic was heavily skewed. Catherine looked me up and down. Her gaze was not filled with the blatant hostility that Aunt Vivian had displayed. Instead, it was dripping with something far more insulting. It was pure, unadulterated pity. She examined my designer jumpsuit, my pristine shoes, and the heavy gold watch on my wrist. I could see her mind working, trying to reconcile the elegant, successful woman standing in front of her with the chaotic, fictional narrative she had been fed by her son and daughter-in-law. "You must be Kiara," Catherine said. Her voice was soft, perfectly modulated, and incredibly condescending. She tilted her head, giving me a look of deep, manufactured sympathy. "Naya and Trevor told us all about your unfortunate debt issues. They mentioned how terribly you have been struggling lately. It is so incredibly brave of you to show your face here today given the circumstances. I am sure your family appreciates you making the effort despite your situation." Charles nodded solemnly beside her, slipping his hands into his pockets. "We hope you are getting the professional help you need, young lady," he added, his tone paternalistic and dismissive. "Addiction of any kind is a heavy burden to bear. We have been praying for your recovery." Behind them, Trevor let out a sharp, strangled cough. "Mom, Dad, we should really go back to the patio," he urged, his voice cracking slightly. "Kiara is just leaving. She just stopped by to say hello and she has to go now. Right, Kiara?" I did not look at Trevor. I kept my eyes locked directly on Catherine. I let a slow, relaxed smile spread across my lips. It was not a defensive smile or an angry one. It was the calm, confident smile of a woman who held the winning lottery ticket and was just waiting for the perfect moment to cash it in. I shifted my gaze past Catherine's shoulder and looked directly at Nia. My sister looked like she was about to collapse right there on the freshly cut grass. The thick, humid summer air seemed to be choking her. Sweat was beading on her forehead, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She was visibly shaking her chest, heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. She mouthed the word "please" at me. It was a pathetic, silent plea for mercy from the same woman who had smirked in victory when I was thrown out of my own home in the middle of the night. She wanted me to protect the lie. She wanted me to absorb the humiliation, swallow my pride, and play the role of the broken addict so she could maintain her fraudulent, wealthy lifestyle. I turned my attention back to Catherine's waiting, expectant face. I adjusted the strap of my expensive leather handbag and squared my shoulders. "Debt issues," I repeated, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "That is absolutely fascinating, Catherine." Truly, it is a remarkably creative story, but I think you have been grossly misinformed about exactly who in this family is drowning in debt. Catherine's fake smile faltered instantly. The polite aristocratic mask slipped just a fraction, revealing a flash of genuine confusion. Misinformed, she echoed, her brow furrowing slightly. I do not understand what you mean. Nia was very clear about why you had to leave the house. She said you were running from dangerous creditors and that you had completely drained your parents' savings to pay them off. I took a slow, measured step forward. My presence commanded the space effortlessly. I did not drain anyone's savings. Catherine, I stated, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that echoed across the silent yard. In fact, I currently work as a financial analyst for Vanguard Capital downtown. I secured that position right out of college with a starting salary of $75,000. I live in a luxury high-rise apartment in Buckhead, and my credit score is absolutely flawless. Charles pulled his hands out of his pockets, his posture stiffening. Vanguard Capital, he asked, his deep voice suddenly losing its condescending edge. You work at Vanguard? I certainly do, Charles replied smoothly. And because I work in high-level finance, I have a very specific set of skills when it comes to tracking money. I know how to audit accounts. I know how to trace wire transfers. And most importantly, I know how to spot a massive fraudulent financial leak when it is sitting right in front of my face. Trevor practically lunged forward, placing his body between me and his parents. Okay, that is enough, he shouted, his voice shrill and completely stripped of its usual corporate confidence. You need to leave right now, Kiara. You are upset and you are making things up. Mom, she is just trying to start drama because she is jealous. Do not listen to her. We need to go inside. But Charles put a firm, heavy hand on Trevor's shoulder and physically pushed his son aside. He was a wealthy businessman who recognized the scent of a bad investment, and right now his own son was reeking of panic. Quiet, Trevor, Charles barked, his eyes never leaving my face. Let the young woman speak. What exactly are you trying to tell us, Kiara? I looked at the crowd of church members and relatives who had formed a tight, silent circle around us. My mother, Darlene, was frozen near the barbecue grill, clutching a pair of tongs like a lifeline. She looked like she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. The entire backyard was holding its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I reached my hand into my designer tote bag. My fingers brushed against the thick, heavy manila envelope I had meticulously prepared for this exact moment. The envelope contained every single bank statement, every highlighted wire transfer, and every undeniable piece of proof that would completely obliterate their entire world. I looked at Trevor, who was now sweating profusely. I looked at Nia, who was silently weeping. And then I looked straight at Charles and Catherine, holding their unwavering gaze. I am trying to tell you that your son and your daughter-in-law are chronic absolute liars, I said, my voice steady and clear, ringing out like a judge delivering a final verdict. And I am about to show you exactly what they have been doing with your money every single month. I pulled the thick, heavy manila envelope from my leather tote bag. The sound of the paper sliding against the leather seemed to amplify in the dead silence of the backyard. I did not hand it to Charles immediately. Instead, I walked deliberately past him, moving straight toward the large glass patio table where they had been sitting just moments before. Trevor lunged forward to intercept me, his hand outstretched to snatch the envelope, but Charles moved faster. The older man grabbed his son's wrist with a grip so tight I could see Trevor's knuckles turn white. Do not touch her, Charles barked, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. Let her put it on the table. Trevor shrank back, his eyes darting frantically toward Nia, who was now openly weeping into her hands. I reached the table and unclasped the metal fastener of the envelope. I did not rush. I let the anticipation build, twisting the knife of their anxiety slowly. I pulled out the crisp, printed bank statements and laid them flat against the glass surface. I arranged them in perfect chronological order, aligning the edges with the exact forensic precision I used in my corporate office. Charles and Catherine stepped up to the table. Aunt Vivian and the rest of the church gossips crowded in as close as they dared, stretching their necks to see the documents. Darlene had finally dropped her barbecue tongs and slowly drifted toward the patio, moving like a woman walking to her own execution. I tapped my manicured index finger against the top line of the most recent statement. I want you to look right here, Catherine, I said. keeping my tone completely even. On the second day of every single month for the past 3 years, a wire transfer of exactly $4,000 originates from your private wealth management trust. The memo line clearly dictates that these funds are specifically designated for a premium nanny service and early childhood development programs. Catherine looked at the paper and nodded slowly, her brow deeply furrowed. Yes, she confirmed, her voice tight. Trevor told us that raising 3 toddlers was overwhelming Nia. We agreed to fully fund a highly qualified professional nanny to ensure our grandchildren receive the best possible care and to alleviate the domestic burden on your sister. We send that money religiously. I smiled a cold, humorless expression. That is incredibly generous of you, I replied. But you have been completely defrauded. Nia and Trevor never hired a professional nanny. They never spent a single dime of that $48,000 a year on early childhood development. I slid the next page of the bank statement forward, highlighting a series of massive outgoing deductions in bright yellow ink. I pointed directly to a recurring charge that hit the account on the 4th of the month, exactly 48 hours after the in-laws' wire transfer cleared. Look at this outgoing payment, I instructed. $1,200 automatically deducted by a luxury auto financing firm. That is the exact monthly lease payment for Trevor's pristine Porsche, sitting in the driveway right now. Charles leaned closer, his jaw tightening as he read the line item. Trevor let out a pathetic whimpering sound. Dad, I can explain, he stammered. It was a temporary reallocation of funds. I did not let him finish the excuse. I slid another page forward, pointing to scattered highlighted charges. It was not temporary, Trevor, I countered sharply. The rest of your premium nanny fund is completely drained by the 15th of every month. It is diverted to high-end designer boutiques, luxury day spas, and lavish restaurant tabs. You have not been funding your grandchildren's care, Catherine. You have been directly subsidizing a fraudulent, luxurious lifestyle that your son and my sister could not actually afford to maintain on their own. Charles leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the highlighted transactions. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as the mathematical reality of his son's massive deception registered in his mind. He looked at the bank statements and then glared at Trevor with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. You stole from us, Charles growled. You lied to your own mother to fund a sports car. But who was watching the children? Catherine asked, her voice trembling as she looked up from the damning bank statements, ignoring her son's panic. If they did not hire the nanny we paid for, who was doing the work? I stood up perfectly straight, locking eyes with my mother, who was now standing at the edge of the patio, completely paralyzed by shame. I stated, my voice ringing across the silent yard. For 4 years they forced me to be their unpaid indentured servant. My mother and Nia pocketed your money and used the heavy, suffocating guilt of family loyalty to chain me to this house. They told me I owed them. They screamed that black families only survive by sacrificing for each other. They made me feel selfish and westernized for wanting to focus on my university studies and build a career. I gestured toward my mother, who physically flinched as if I had struck her. When I finally graduated and landed a corporate job paying $75,000 a year, my mother demanded that I quit immediately. Why? Because if I went to work, Nia and Trevor would be forced to actually hire the nanny you were paying for. That meant their free luxury income would instantly vanish. The Porsche lease would default. The designer shopping sprees would end. Aunt Vivian gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The whispers among the church members erupted into a loud chorus of shocked murmurs. They were finally hearing the unvarnished truth. So when I refused to quit my new job and stay home to be their free babysitter, my mother threw my bags onto the front lawn. At 11 o'clock at night, I concluded, my gaze sweeping over the horrified faces of the crowd. They kicked me out onto the street simply to protect the stolen money you were sending them. And then they had the absolute nerve to stand in church and tell all of you that I was a gambling addict to cover their tracks. Charles stood frozen for a fraction of a second, processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Then the aristocratic composure he had maintained for decades completely vanished. He grabbed the bank statements from the glass patio table, his hands shaking with a terrifying suppressed rage. He shoved the papers directly into Trevor's chest, forcing his son to stumble backward against a heavy wrought iron chair. "Explain this!" Charles roared, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent yard. "Explain to me how my hard-earned money, the money I sent to protect my grandchildren, ended up financing your sports car." Trevor raised his hands in a frantic pleading gesture. "Dad, it is a misunderstanding," he stammered, sweat pouring down his face and soaking the collar of his expensive linen shirt. "Kiara is twisting the data to make us look bad. We meant to hire a nanny, but the kids were just so comfortable with her, and the money just got mixed up in our joint accounts. It was an honest administrative error." Catherine stepped forward, her designer heels clicking sharply on the stone patio. "Do not insult my intelligence, Trevor," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet octave that commanded instant absolute submission. "Administrative errors do not pay for luxury car leases on the exact same day of every single month. Administrative errors do not buy designer handbags and lavish dinners. You looked me in the eye and thanked me for funding a professional childcare service while you treated your own sister-in-law like an indentured servant. You absolutely disgust me." Trevor, realizing his father was completely immune to his excuses, desperately tried to pivot. He pointed a shaking finger at Nia, who was still cowering behind the patio furniture. "It was her idea," Trevor shouted, throwing his wife entirely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. "Nia and Darlene set up the account. They managed the transfers. Nia told me it was fine to use the surplus for the car. I was just trusting my wife." Nia gasped loudly, a sound of pure betrayed horror escaping her throat. She stared at the man she had built her entire fake life around, watching him abandon her to save his own skin. "How could you say that?" Nia shrieked, her voice hoarse and raw. "You drove the car, Trevor. You wore the expensive watches. You loved the lifestyle just as much as I did." Charles raised his hand, demanding absolute silence. "I do not care whose idea it was," Charles stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "The bank of Mom and Dad is officially permanently closed. We are cutting off your trust distributions effective immediately. We are contacting our lawyers on Monday to audit every single dime we have ever given you. And if you cannot afford the mortgage on that massive house you live in, I suggest you start packing boxes tonight." Trevor looked like he had been physically struck. His entire corporate identity, his wealth, his status, it was all evaporating right in front of his eyes. While Trevor and Nia were watching their financial empire turn to dust, the shockwave of the revelation was violently ripping through the rest of the backyard. Aunt Vivian, who had been standing frozen near the buffet tables, suddenly pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Her face was contorted into a mask of absolute fury, but this time the anger was not directed at me. She turned her blazing gaze directly onto my mother. Darlene Vivian barked, her loud booming voice, shattering any remaining illusion of peace. "You stood in the sanctuary of our church. You stood in front of the congregation and wept. You asked the pastor to pray for your lost daughter who was consumed by the sins of gambling and greed. You asked us to pray for your broken heart, and all this time you were the one stealing. You were the one orchestrating a massive fraud to buy yourself day spa treatments." The church members who had previously been whispering insults about me were now glaring at my mother with blatant, unfiltered disgust. The realization that they had been actively weaponized, that their prayers and sympathies had been fraudulently harvested to cover up a financial crime, was deeply, profoundly offensive to them. My mother, Darlene, suddenly realized she was entirely surrounded by enemies. The wealthy in-laws despised her. The church community felt completely violated. Her own daughter, Nia, was currently hyperventilating on the patio. The impenetrable fortress of her social standing had just been blown completely wide open. Relying on the only tactic she had ever known, Darlene immediately tried to play the victim. Her eyes filled with rapid, practiced tears, and her lower lip began to tremble. She clutched her chest, swaying slightly on her feet, as if the stress of the accusation was causing her physical pain. "I was only trying to hold this family together," Darlene wailed, her voice cracking with theatrical perfection. "I made a mistake, but I did it out of love. I was trying to make sure Nia had a good life. I was trying to protect my grandchildren. Kiara is twisting this to destroy me because she has always been jealous of her sister. Please, you have to understand a mother's heart. She reached her hand out toward Aunt Vivian, desperately seeking the validation she had always relied upon. But the magic spell was broken. The tears that had successfully manipulated our family for decades suddenly had absolutely no effect. Aunt Vivian simply crossed her arms and took a very deliberate physical step backward, actively refusing to offer comfort. "Do not try to use those fake tears on me," Darlene Vivian said, her voice dripping with cold, hard contempt. "A real mother does not throw her youngest child out onto the street in the dead of night to protect a stolen paycheck. You are a disgrace to this family, and you are a disgrace to the community. You lied to God and you lied to us." Darlene let out a strangled, pathetic sob. She looked around the yard, desperately searching the faces of her friends, her relatives, and her neighbors for a single shred of sympathy. She found absolutely nothing but hard, judgmental stares. The facade of the perfect, tightly knit, affluent family was completely, entirely shattered. The pristine suburban cookout had transformed into a graveyard of broken lies and burned bridges. I stood there watching the woman who had terrorized me my entire life finally face the bitter reality of her own actions. Darlene was completely surrounded by the shattered ruins of her pristine suburban reputation. The church elders she had spent decades trying to impress were actively turning their backs on her, muttering in disgusted disbelief. But my work here was not completely finished. There was one last loose end that needed to be tied up. I turned my attention away from my weeping mother and focused my gaze directly on Trevor. Trevor was currently leaning heavily against the expensive outdoor dining table, looking like a man who had just been sentenced to life in prison. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his sweat-soaked linen shirt. He was frantically trying to calculate how he was going to survive without his parents' massive trust fund distributions. I was so consumed by the sudden catastrophic loss of his personal wealth that he had completely forgotten about the severe professional threat hanging over his head. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward him. The sound of my heels against the stone patio made him flinch. I smoothed the lapel of my crimson jumpsuit and offered him a tight professional smile. The kind of smile executives give right before they terminate a contract. "Oh, by the way, Trevor," I said, my voice carrying a bright, cheerful tone that severely contrasted with the absolute destruction happening around us. "Since we are airing out all of our financial secrets today, I thought I should give you a quick update regarding your professional life." Trevor blinked, his bloodshot eyes widening in fresh panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Charles, who had been preparing to escort his wife out of the yard, stopped and turned back around. His sharp business instincts immediately kicked in, sensing that another massive shoe was about to drop. I looked directly into Trevor's terrified eyes. "You really should have done your research before you tried to destroy my career." I continued, my voice ringing with cold, calculated authority. "When you called Vanguard Capital on Tuesday morning to fraudulently accuse me of theft and mental instability, you made a fatal miscalculation. You see, Trevor, my managing director, does not tolerate entitled men attempting to weaponize her human resources department to settle petty domestic disputes." Charles stepped forward, his posture rigid with outrage. "You called her employer," Charles demanded, his voice dropping into a deadly authoritative register. "You attempted to sabotage this young woman's livelihood out of sheer spite." I did not let Trevor formulate an excuse. I kept my eyes locked on him entirely, ignoring his father's outburst. "And because you were arrogant enough to make that phone call," I explained, "I was granted full unrestricted access to a highly confidential file that landed on my managing director's desk 3 weeks ago. A pitch deck for a $25 million Series B funding round submitted by none other than Nexus Cloud Solutions." Trevor's knees physically buckled. He grabbed the edge of the glass table to stop himself from collapsing entirely onto the patio. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He finally realized the sheer magnitude of his mistake. He had handed the financial life support cord of his entire failing company directly to the sister-in-law he had just tried to render homeless. "I was appointed as the lead forensic analyst for your audit," I stated, allowing each word to hit him like a physical blow. "For the past 3 days, I have dissected your valuation models, your revenue projections, and your incredibly bloated executive expense accounts. I ripped your ledger apart line by line, Trevor. I saw the catastrophic burn rate you have been desperately trying to hide from your current venture partners. Trevor let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. Kiara, please! He begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Please do not do this. My venture partners will pull out. The company will go under. I will lose everything. I tilted my head, looking at him with absolute zero pity. My firm reviewed your company's funding pitch, I announced, delivering the final lethal strike with flawless professional execution. Based on your recent attempt to fraudulently sabotage my employment and the massive financial negligence I uncovered in your audit, we determined your leadership lacks the integrity required for our portfolio. Your funding is officially denied. The words hung in the suffocating summer air, sealing his absolute ruin. But I was not finished. And just to be clear, Trevor, I added smoothly, Vanguard Capital does not operate in a vacuum. My managing director has already flagged your fraudulent behavior to our extensive network of partner institutions. Word travels exceptionally fast in the Atlanta tech sphere. No reputable venture capital firm is going to touch Nexus Cloud Solutions. Your career in this city is completely permanently over. Trevor let out a loud, guttural scream of pure, unfiltered agony. The realization that he had just single-handedly destroyed his own company, his reputation, and his entire professional future completely shattered his remaining sanity. He spun around and turned his blazing, furious eyes directly onto Nia. "This is your fault!" Trevor roared, his voice echoing violently across the manicured lawn. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger right at his weeping wife. "You and your greedy, manipulative mother dragged me into this mess. You told me she was just a stupid college kid. You told me we could scare her into coming back. You ruined my life, Nia. You destroyed everything." Nia scrambled backward, completely terrified by the sheer raw hatred radiating from her husband. She tripped over the hem of her designer dress and fell hard onto the grass, scrambling away from him like a frightened animal. "I did not know Trevor." She sobbed, her hands raised defensively. "I did not know she worked for them. Please do not leave me. I am divorcing you." Trevor screamed, tearing his expensive watch off his wrist and throwing it violently onto the patio. "I am taking the kids, and I am calling my lawyers tomorrow morning. You and your psychotic family can rot in this miserable house." Charles and Catherine watched the spectacle with expressions of absolute profound disgust. They had seen more than enough. Catherine adjusted her designer handbag and looked down at Darlene, who was still sobbing quietly near the barbecue grill. "You are the most morally bankrupt people I have ever had the misfortune of meeting," Catherine stated, her voice dripping with lethal aristocratic disdain. "Do not ever attempt to contact our family again. You will be hearing from our legal team regarding the funds you stole." Charles did not even look at his son. He placed his hand on the small of his wife's back and guided her purposefully toward the side gate. They walked out of the yard without a single backward glance, leaving Trevor hyperventilating on the patio and Nia sobbing hysterically in the grass. The church members and extended relatives immediately began to follow suit. The barbecue was officially over. People murmured in shocked, hushed tones as they quickly gathered their purses and rushed toward the exit, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of my mother's spectacular collapse. Aunt Vivian gave Darlene one final look of pure condemnation before shaking her head and marching out the gate. Within 5 minutes, the sprawling, lively backyard was completely deserted. The upbeat rhythm and blues music continued to play softly from the outdoor speakers, creating a hauntingly cheerful soundtrack for the absolute devastation left behind. Darlene was left standing entirely alone in the center of her expensive, perfectly manicured lawn. The facade of the perfect, wealthy, tight-knit family she had sacrificed my future to build had been burned to the ground, and the ashes were blowing away in the humid summer breeze. I stood in the center of that ruined backyard and took one final look at the people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel incredibly small. Trevor was still hyperventilating on the stone patio, his hands gripping his hair in absolute despair as he muttered frantically to himself about bankruptcy and corporate lawyers. Nia remained crumbled in the grass, her stained designer dress bunched around her knees, sobbing so hard her shoulders shook violently. And my mother, Darlene, stood perfectly still by the cold barbecue grill, staring blankly at the empty wooden gate where her wealthy guests, and her entire social standing had just vanished. Not a single one of them looked at me. They were completely, entirely consumed by the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. I was no longer their scapegoat. I was no longer their unpaid servant or their emotional punching bag. I was simply the mirror that had finally forced them to look at their own ugly, distorted reflections. I turned my back on the wreckage and began walking toward the side gate. The upbeat rhythm and blues track playing from the outdoor speakers provided a surreal, triumphant soundtrack to my departure. My designer heels clicked sharply against the stepping stones, a steady, confident rhythm that marked the absolute end of an era. I did not rush. I took my time walking past the abandoned plates of potato salad and half-eaten ribs. I pushed open the heavy wooden gate and stepped out into the front driveway, leaving the chaotic noise behind me. The humid Georgia air suddenly felt entirely different. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had always clung to my chest whenever I stood near this house was completely gone. The air felt crisp, clean, and overflowing with infinite possibility. I walked down the concrete driveway toward my gleaming luxury sedan. Nobody chased after me. Nobody screamed my name begging me to come back and fix their mess. They knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the bridge was burned to ash, and the ashes had been scattered to the wind. I reached my car and pressed the unlock button on my key fob. The sleek headlights flashed brilliantly in the fading afternoon sun. I opened the heavy solid door and slipped into the driver's seat. The interior smelled like rich new leather and unwritten futures. I closed the door, shutting out the faint sounds of the suburban neighborhood completely. I placed my hands on the smooth steering wheel, taking a deep, slow breath that filled my lungs. For the very first time in my 22 years of existence, my spirit belonged entirely to me. I turned the key in the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life, a deep, satisfying purr that vibrated through the chassis. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching my childhood home shrink smaller and smaller until it was swallowed by the leafy green trees at the end of the street. I turned onto the main avenue, heading directly toward the highway that would take me back downtown. As the towering glass and steel skyline of Atlanta emerged on the horizon, rising like a glittering monument to ambition and survival, I reached over and turned the volume up on the radio. I drove back to my kingdom, leaving the ghost of the scared, compliant little girl far behind me. The scene shifts smoothly, the view of the highway dissolving into the breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline at sunset. We are back in the present day, inside my immaculate luxury high-rise apartment. The golden hour light floods through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm, victorious glow across the pristine hardwood floors and the plush emerald green velvet sofa. I am sitting comfortably on that sofa, wearing a crisp, tailored white blazer over a silk camisole. My posture is relaxed, but undeniably powerful. I look directly into the camera lens, bridging the gap between my story and the audience. It has been exactly 2 years since that explosive summer afternoon. I say, my voice calm, steady, and resonating with absolute peace. Trevor and Nia finalized their messy, bitter divorce 9 months later. His venture partners pulled their funding entirely, and Nexus Cloud Solutions filed for bankruptcy shortly after. He was forced to sell his luxury vehicles and downsize into a cramped apartment, fighting Nia in family court over every single dime they had left. My mother was forced to sell that beautiful suburban house to pay off the mounting debts she had accumulated trying to maintain her fake high society lifestyle. She moved into a small, modest condo on the outskirts of the city, completely alienated from the church community she had lied to. Meanwhile, Vanguard Capital promoted me to a senior portfolio manager position. My career skyrocketed because I was finally pouring every ounce of my energy into my own growth, instead of setting myself on fire to keep my toxic family warm. I built wealth. I built genuine friendships, and most importantly, I built an unshakable sense of self-respect. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands gracefully on my knees. I want you to listen to me very carefully. Society will tell you that family is absolutely everything. They will try to convince you that sharing blood with someone means you owe them your time, your peace, and your future. They will weaponize concepts like loyalty and respect to keep you trapped in cycles of generational abuse and financial exploitation. They will demand that you shrink yourself so they can feel big. But blood does not entitle anyone to abuse you. DNA is not a blank check for exploitation. The most profound act of self-love you can ever commit is recognizing when the people who are supposed to protect you are actually the ones destroying you. They threw my bags onto the front lawn, expecting me to wither away and die without their validation. They tried to bury me under a mountain of lies, guilt, and impossible expectations. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They tried to bury me, but they did not realize I was a seed. Never let the word family be the reason you accept abuse. Never let cultural expectations convince you that your success is a betrayal of your roots. You are allowed to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. You are allowed to build a beautiful, thriving life that absolutely infuriates the people who wanted you to fail. Your primary duty in this world is not to be a compliant stepping stone for someone else's comfort. Your primary duty is to protect your own peace and actualize your own limitless potential. I lean back, offering a genuine warm smile to the camera. If my story resonates with you, if you are currently fighting to break your own generational curses and establish boundaries that protect your future, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your own experiences of walking away from toxic family dynamics. We draw immense strength from hearing each other's victories. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who might need a reminder of their own incredible power today. You are worthy of a peaceful, thriving life. Do not ever let anyone convince you otherwise. The camera slowly pulls back, widening the shot to show the breathtaking expanse of the city skyline glowing brilliantly behind me. The screen gently fades to a deep, solid black,